If you haven't seen the Apocalypse one, let me tell you that this video was originally recorded for the Anime North Momiji Online Experience panel. If you have seen the Apocalypse one, then, well, deja vu. This video condenses a lot of the 1000 Isekai stuff that Damien and I talk about, but I tried to condense it in a way that made it a lot more accessible. It might come off as a little strange to people who already understand a lot of the things that I'm already talking about with Isekai, and so it might not be helpful for you in that sense, but I do think for a lot of people it might be a helpful basic primer. Now I do want to mention that this video was edited, shot, and composed within a span of a day. So it was functionally made in 24 hours, and then I ran into a sort of rendering snafu within the next 24 hours. So I guess you could say it was finished in 2 days, but this is a 24-hour cut job, so I do apologize if there's any sort of problems with the editing or presentation or anything like that. My bad. So yeah, let's get this started. So, what's Isekai? What does it come from? What does it mean? What does it entail? If you watch anime or read manga, you've probably come across a lot of these suckers. Stories about people being in another world, having fantastical powers or abilities, and just... they're kind of everywhere. And while it might seem like just a fad, Isekai as we know it in the West has a very interesting and long history, partly aided and spread by the ongoing communities in which it exists and is promulgated. Hi there, my name is Joe, I run the channel Pause to Select, and I'm going to be talking about Isekai. What are Isekai, some of the terminology surrounding them, what is some of the dialogue in Japan, and exactly how they blew up and why they blew up as they did. I want to say that a lot of this is based on my experiences in conversations with authors. This is, relatively speaking, a fairly new topic of discussion, and while a lot of folks are already talking about it from the perspective of anime YouTube or blogs, for the most part, because it's still ongoing, we don't have a real scholarly literature field to work with. I think if you're interested in this topic, it's a great time to start looking into it, because it's kind of a wild west at the moment. So, what are Isekai? It's important to know what we're talking about when we're talking about Isekai because we can use it to define a lot of things, and how we define it can tell us about how to trace back some of those elements. And this is really, really important with Isekai because it just kind of means another world, but that otherworldliness brings up some pretty important questions. Why not something like Ikai, or Hoka no Sekai, or Besekai? Why Isekai? And if we chart through Isekai specifically, what is that telling us? This is even more important considering that Isekai can refer to, well, Isekai, but in a general sense. Because it means another world, this can be used to refer to, quite literally, another world. If we stretch the definition of otherworld as simply another place, then we can extend that as far back as, say, stories about the Divine Comedy or Izanagi descending into Yomi. This falls back into questions of usefulness in research. We can say that Isekai has roots in the Divine Comedy, for instance, but what does, if at all, does that tell us about the conditions of modern-day Isekai? Think of it like melodrama. We can look at a text and say that it has elements of melodrama, but it might not necessarily be registered as directly melodrama in the historical genre sense. And we can think of Isekai having similar challenges. Furthermore, I asked the same question, what are Isekai, to several authors? And one author mentions that they found it quite hard to pin down what they thought the first Isekai story was. And on a lot of bases, many authors acknowledge a sort of Occidentalist origin. Inori, author of I Favour the Villainness, for instance, traces their origins of Isekai back to Western fiction rather than Japanese ones. And another author claims that the first one that comes to mind is John Carter of Mars, stating that it is, of course, Isekai. But then the same author notes that they also thought that stories like Urashima Taro, the boy on the turtle visiting the underwater kingdom, is also, in a sense, Isekai. So, in this situation, is a definition possible? I think it's important, therefore, to focus less on a strict definition that encapsulates everything. And more so, I argue to understand on how some of these trends and forms emerge. At the same time, it's vital to acknowledge that there are many ways in which we can think of isekai as a cluster of ideas linked together to give us a picture, but not to define what must be isekai. But what and how do we explain the explosion of otherworldly stories we see today? Isekai, in effect, have been around for a very long time. We can chart, for instance, Takechio Haruka's Isekai no Yushi from 1981, but the idea of otherworldly transmission, at least as they're understood in Isekai, the genre proper, can be traced through L. Sprague de Camp's The Complete Enchanter or Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter of Mars, and functionally, there was really more of a science fiction element to a lot of this. For instance, you can see how some of these sensibilities would go on to influence texts like Aura Battler Dunbine, which then carries on into a lineage like Knights and Magic through Mecha. But at the same time, there was also another lineage that was being developed. Anime and manga scholar Keiichiro Morikawa in Birth of the Personaopolis notes that, for example, that isekai was used often by otaku to mark demarcations. Morikawa notes that when you look at places like Shibuya, there are these fortresses of glass where you can peer into and see what's on display, what's being sold, and most importantly, how you can change yourself, outfit yourself, and be more like them. He describes it as a cosmopolitan feeling, but Morikawa juxtaposes that with Akihabara. Akiba, he notes, is a sort of occluded place where people, he argues, can find themselves in their hobbies and icons. Buildings can be these large windowless places separating the real world from the virtual world that exists within them. This closed-off space had a term. It was isekai. And so you can find, in this sense, a different kind of narrative lineage. Unlike the heroic science fiction lineage of isekai in one sense, coming from folks like Haruka in Isekai no Yushi, you also had a completely different lineage emerge, ones that you can see, for instance, in Daisuke Goya's 2001 novel series Eiku no Senso, which depicts a military history otaku who's sent to another world and teams up with the Demon King to fight off against the humans. But that Demon King, it turns out, is an otaku, who's essentially turned the Demon Kingdom into Akiba. And that lineage of Akiba as isekai can be seen in Tono Mamare's Log Horizon, giving that their base of operations in this world is an Akiba. We don't even have to stop there. You can find the sort of Alice in Wonderland influences, which was huge in Japan, focusing on the roles of girls and women who must navigate these incredibly hostile environments, which you can see in texts like Onofuyumi's The 12 Kingdoms. In this case, there is a different set of influences to these specific texts compared to, say, the old sci-fi settings of Yushi or perhaps the Akiba stories of Goya. And we can see how a transition of young women navigating new environments carry on in works like Didn't I Say to Make My Abilities Average? So what does this mean? What's this leading to? I can't stress this enough, and I think if there's something that has to be argued, it's that isekai, specifically the genre that we know as isekai, don't have a singular textual ancestral lineage. It's a hodgepodge of different lineages, a constellation of various works influencing each other in parallel and only sometimes crisscrossing to birth new imaginations of otherworldliness. Narratively speaking, there isn't really an isekai that birthed them. But there is, amusingly, a platform that we can't ignore. Though Knights and Magic, Log Horizon, and Nokin all have different influences and beats, they all came from the same site. When people think about isekai or talk about isekai, they usually think about a specific kind of story, a specific kind of imagination, and that is because of Shousetsuka Ninaro. Originally a fanfiction site from the early 2000s, Shousetsu's transition into original work was fairly huge. According to one author, online original work distribution wasn't as centralized. Some folks would have writing groups, others would post on their own blogs, and where there were more centralized sites for content, it seemed that it tended to focus on one specific element. Syosetu, in that situation, acted as a more general hub. In addition to this general hub, Syosetu also had an incredibly robust set of blogging, following, and data analytics tools, each implemented bit by bit over the years that gave each of its users and writers extremely helpful information on who their audiences are, what their audiences prefer, and multiple ways in which users can interact with authors. This, in addition to its tag-based categorization and search features, makes Syosetu less like sites like fanfiction.net and DeviantArt, and more like YouTube. And Syosetu, while it was one of the earlier ones, wasn't the only one. Arcadia, where Overlord was originally published, and Kakuyomu, which nowadays can be considered Syosetu's main competitive platform and the home of Kasha's Hero, is also another. Now, the reason why the platform is essential to understanding Isekai is because of how these platforms help shape the ways in which users and amateur authors interact with each other. Tsuda Hoko argues that one of the reasons why these platforms explode is because users can give instant feedback. They have a sort of direct connection with content creators, giving them a producer-like feeling. In comparison, authors have an incentive to maintain a user fanbase given that user reviews increase the number of points stories have. And thus, as a result, interaction and feedback becomes a sort of gamified currency that can bring certain stories up to the top. Likewise, because these authors tend to be amateur authors and don't have any requirements on how often they should be publishing, one of the major characteristics of these kinds of stories is the frequency with which readers and authors are in dialogue with each other. That, with the lack of editors, to an author, the only thing sometimes that verifies whether people find their works interesting or not is the direct feedback from their readers and the numbers in their analytics. And this extends more so into the ways in which Syosetu tends to finagle and push specific tags and how they categorize stories. Syosetu at the time of this video tends to place stories into groups. Does it happen to be in this world, or is there a jump? Is it high fantasy, or is it low fantasy? Does it have game-like elements? Each categorization not only gives it a better idea on how to slot stories in, but it also gives companies a better idea of what type of stories to pursue, especially given that sites like Syosetu and Kakuyomu have really exploded, not only with views and submissions, but contests, where prizes can range from money right up to publication. And with the explosion of popularity of Syosetu texts like ReZero and Log Horizon, it's no surprise that the site continues to be a huge well for creative content. When you look at shows like Knights and Magic, Isekai Smartphone, and I Said to Make My Abilities Average, not only did they develop robust and strong fan communities of their own, but they did it largely because they were cultivating very heavily on Syosetu. But even authors don't get to decide what becomes popular. In a correspondence with one author, they mentioned to me that the text that got them an anime adaptation wasn't the one that took them nearly a decade to plan and conceive, but it was the one that they planned in just weeks. Just like YouTubers, sometimes what blows up is outside of the control of the YouTuber. But instead of vlogging videos or video essays or explanation videos, this is fiction. They're writing stories, but these authors don't necessarily get to decide which story gains the audience. But of course, that only explains how Syosetu works. So why Isekai? In the early 2000s, due to the neoliberal structural reforms by Junichiro Koizumi and a general increase in precarity, especially among Japan's younger demographics, there was an explosion of what Uno Tsunehiro calls survival-type stories, or sabaibuke. In general, they're pretty intuitive. They're stories that largely revolve around young people who have to compete against other young people to survive, and the ones who survive tend to be the ones who most effectively understand and can navigate and command the rules of the game. The idea here is that it captures a sort of anxiety that exists among Japan's youth. You either understand and you play the game, or somebody screws you over or you're ostracized. Texts like Battle Royale and Btoom are among them. but it really hit a crescendo with texts like Death Note and Sword Art Online. Though SAO has been around for a really long time, it largely exploded due to a major push by the magazine Kono Raito Noberu ga Sugoi. This light novel is outstanding. And you can see the sort of survival type DNA in its text. SAO is quite literally a death game, a story in which people are stuck and they must navigate the various levels of Aincrad to survive. And you can see this dungeon diving logic extend even in Isekai. The gamey interfaces is on one level a fun callback to games that influence the authors, but also on another level calcifies pre-existing concerns about the unfair nature of society. You can see how, for example, in Sakamoto's 666 Dungeon Seeker, the manga ends quite unceremoniously with the protagonist returning to his world, the last panel ominously claiming that the world is a dungeon. And Sword Art Online, while not Isekai proper, does act as a very illuminating bridge between death game stories and Isekai nowadays, the realization and navigation of a game-like world. But SAO was also notable in promulgating a specific kind of archetype. Naro, or Naroke. Everyone likely knows or has some idea of what Naro is. Naro refers to shousetsuga ni naro and is a largely pejorative term used to describe a specific kind of story, ones with characters, largely men, who have cheap powers, harems, and in most cases, some kind of rehabilitative quality, such as compensatory reincarnation or escape from some kind of space. When people think about a lot of modern-day isekai, they're actually referring to Naro. Stories like Isekai Smartphone and Death March to a Parallel Rhapsody are Naro stories, but then again so are stories like Mahoka no Retose and Sword Art Online, and they aren't actually isekai. Because they emerge in particularly online amateur spaces, contemporary isekai are more likely to be categorized based on the elements they have, rather than any singular driving ideology. So this is important. Azuma Hiroki describes this as databasification, where there exists a socially formed set of terms and ideas which readers read and interpret a story in relation to. In other words, these stories are written and understood not based upon the entirety of its message, but rather how the constituent parts interact with other constituent parts. We relate and understand specific elements differently, thus creating a sort of unique cluster of interpretation that varies from person to person. And it's with this in mind that isekai is more valuable to be understood as a collection of components rather than any holistic fashion. So here's the question. What are some of the ways in which we can think about them? One of the ways we can think about them is how they jump. For instance, isekai tend to fall into some fairly large categories, among them being tensei, tenni, and shokan. Each of these refers to how they're sent over, because the logic of how they're sent over tells us a bit about what the narrative legitimizes and what it tells us about ongoing ideological concerns arising in these stories. In other words, the ways in which these stories unfurl can give us a lot of insight into their general narrative logic. Tensei, for instance, refers to reincarnation stories, and the way in which they're reincarnated tells us a lot about concerns on anxiety and positions in society. Since characters are killed, whether accidentally or on purpose, it gives us a lot of information as to what the normal explanation for why these people die are. For instance, while the reference to trucks is nowadays goofy, up to and including self-parody isekai that use the truck as a joke, one of Akiba's largest recent massacres, the 2008 killing spree by Kato Tomohiro, was by a truck.
Police say a man rammed a truck into a crowd of shoppers. They say he jumped out of the rented truck, began stabbing people that he'd knocked down, then turned his attention to the horrified bystanders.
And that's not even to get into isekai, where reincarnation reveals a fundamentally malformed work culture. One of the common elements of death is simply karoshi, or death by overwork, which brings up questions about the precarity of Japan's working force and the idea of hard work. These stories can be very anti-nekketsu, or stories of hot-bloodedness. Because in nekketsu, protagonists constantly fight against the odds, and through their hard work and determination, they grow up and they believe that such tribulations make them better people. But in a 4Gamer discussion, writer Kaya notes that the illusion of hard work paying off isn't as compelling because there are cases of people who simply win based on their talents, their family, and so on. And in a sense, the inverse is also true, that there are people who work hard and functionally have nothing to show for it. And while not every Tensei Isekai is like this, the conditions of their death tends to give a lot of insight into what legitimizes their deaths, what makes something fair or unfair, and what that tells us about greater social issues in contemporary society. Even in incredibly lighthearted Tensei such as Nokin, characters can and do make requests from a deity figure because there are specific things they just don't want to deal with. We can also extend this idea into Tenni, transfer, or isekai that focus on the movement of people, goods, and objects between spaces. Tenni is often associated with a look at the benefits and strength of a modern industrial system, and that often carries a sort of imperialistic logic. Because Japan can't exert its own military force as a display of hard power, it often depends on soft power projection, specifically its cultural artifacts, notably its language, food, anime, manga, and literature. Thus, the central tenet that arises in many tenni are how an individual or individuals bring over elements that give them a leg up, even if they co-opt native labor and resources. Outbreak Company, for instance, is partly a critique of the Cool Japan program, sending students from the otherworld into Japanese language schools so that they become better mediators with the Japanese. Or in Gate, where the harem otaku foreground is actually undergirded by discussions about resource anxieties. The move to stop the dragon, for example, is legitimized as a search for resources. In these sorts of isekai, Japan's national identity and security anxiety is often reevaluated, and a sort of imperialistic logic is reconsidered. And this doesn't even extend to outwardly militaristic isekai like Nihon Koku Shokan. We can go even further than that. One of Japan's major soft power exports is food, and many food isekai, some outwardly imbibing a cool Japan ethos by showcasing restaurants, carries a similar reasoning. It's up to the restaurant in Isekai Izakaya, for instance, to teach the locals how to deliciously prepare eel, or it's up to the chef of Isekai Shokudo to invent a pasta dish. Through a superior logistical imagination, tenni isekai often fetishize their own modernity. But again, that's not even the only one. The third major one, shokan, refers to isekai where people are summoned, usually involving a sort of gamey call to action where people are tasked with defeating the Demon King. Shokan goes as far back at least as Yushi, but one of the major elements associated with it is whether the protagonists actually accept that call to action. Furthermore, not only do they tend to be more gamey isekai, given that much of the summoning is baked into the sense of questing, but they also tend to be some of the more socio-culturally broad, whereas tenni and tensei tend to have much clearer delineations in terms of how they operate, since those often, but not always, dial back how do people get there. Shokan are a lot broader about it, and thus it's no surprise that in some senses, many of them function similarly on a sort of gamified logic. The game-like logic of shokan isekai are also quite important in that the call to action, to defeat the Demon King, is a space rife for other alternative explanations or perspectives of exploration. How and why the call to action is answered or rejected tells us a bit about the conditions of the characters. In many shokan, characters might not necessarily want to actually respond to that call to action. In Tondemo Skill, the protagonist fundamentally rejects it, even when his younger summoned comrades accept it. In that situation, given his salaryman position, there is a sort of double lensing that occurs. From the perspective of one group, the call to action is a true earnest call to adventure. On the other, the call to action is another request to be put into the grinder, to be part of a system you don't want to be a part of. Shokan can oftentimes lead to questions of usefulness and how to deal with betrayal. While the Japanese subject yearns or sees adventure, the natives of the world can bite back, using them as weapons for their own political gain. For instance, while Rimuru is reincarnated into the other world, there are still heroes whom are summoned, and in one case, they were summoned to be weapons of war. Or in Nidome no Yusha, the protagonist is summoned but is also betrayed. In this sense, they develop a completely different perspective on the world, that the call to action is actually a call to become a cog in a machine. And once again, it lends us back to these questions of greater socio-cultural concerns. And yet, at the same time, Isekai have so many more tags. At the time of this video, syosetu is hugely pushing for otome game stories, and isekai often have numerous tags. Arifureta, for instance, are what is known as revenge stories, zanma, or that Shield Hero also crosses over with nariagari, stories of characters rising up and challenging the odds. But these labels, while they often intersect themselves with isekai, aren't unique to isekai. And this is important. I think, on some level, a study of isekai is most helpful understanding based upon their unique characteristic, the jump over into the other world, the world in which they find themselves. And in my own experiences, we're starting to see the explosion of stories that don't even have to be isekai. Dungeon stories like Danmachi and Goblin Slayer have their own distinct lineages, and in that sense, while they might overlap with isekai, these sensibilities can be quite different. As I said, this video is meant to just be an introduction to isekai, and I mean it. The isekai we see today are an intersection between a strong push by amateur authors and more democratizing publishing efforts on these platforms. And sometimes the ways in which they're written can be a byproduct, more so of what audiences want and how they express what they want. But at the same time, it also gives us valuable insight into how authors, especially amateur authors, propose, conceive, and map out stories. And so in this context, I understand that this video kind of just ends, that there isn't really a conclusion. But at this moment, well, neither have isekai. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed the thumbnails. I'm drawing all of my thumbnails now, and the final pictures will all be available for patrons or anything like that. But, you know, I draw all my thumbnails now, and I record them or take a picture of them with a camera, so it has this sort of like live-action footage kind of vibe to it. I don't know if it actually works, but I do think it is an interesting way in portraying it, in my opinion, right? And of course, the question with this particular video is, okay, why did I talk about the things I talked about, and why did I present the way I presented them? Well, the answer is simply because I had 30 minutes to do it, and this functionally has to be a video for people who are interested or might know about isekai, but might not necessarily have a lot of the information with them as to exactly how isekai operate. They might just see, like, for instance, isekai anime and just might have passing interest in that kind of thing. And as a result, it is very important to try and cover the bases and sort of set up some of the major terms that might be helpful. In this context, a lot of people might sort of not like the video because it doesn't seem to have a particular driving argument, which is a fair criticism. But I think the only driving argument that I have really in this video is that there isn't really sort of one isekai lineage, there's a whole bunch of them. And I didn't even get through all of them. I only touched upon 3 of them. And so in this context, right, people might say, well, why didn't you talk about other lineages like this? And the answer is simply, well, there's so many of them going on at the same time, it was really sort of demonstrative more so than to sort of unveil all of them. It was choosing those 3 gives us an idea of how all of them are running in parallel, or sometimes crisscrossing, all that kind of stuff. And thus, as a result, it is important to keep that in mind when we're thinking about isekai. It's also for the same reason that I didn't get into as much of syosetu as I want. I didn't do a real breakdown of sort of its data analytics or its how the platform actually functions on a day-to-day level. I didn't talk about kakuyomu and how that functions, what differences or similarities might exist between that. It's just a whole bunch of things that I could have talked about, but I just didn't because it had to be a short, digestible, condensed piece of media for people who might not know anything about Isekai. They might just know the name. And so as a result, it is, in that sense, a video for that particular audience, for that particular kind of idea. Nevertheless, huge shoutouts to the authors who are willing to talk to me. Inori, for instance, huge shoutouts to Inori, the author of I Favour the Villainness, has largely been my guardian angel in terms of getting a lot of information. They've been hugely helpful, and I love them to death for that. Please check out I Favour the Villainness wherever you can. They got a manga adaptation of it. Please support them however you can. It's a fantastic story, and if you're interested in Yuri Isekai, which is kind of growing, but it's not a huge one yet, Yuri Isekai, Tomoe game Yuri Isekai is especially, it is a phenomenal piece of work. It's very well written. Please check it out. They are huge in terms of helping me out with the next with the next 1,000 Isekai. I have to get the conversation that we had translated. I have to translate that and then get it checked and then make sure that they're okay with the final translation, all that kind of stuff, before I can get working on that particular script. But that's going to be in the works, so huge ups to them. I keep rambling now. Thank you very much also to Damien Hilaire on Twitter. He knows a lot of isekai stuff, probably more than me. And huge thanks out to Damien for double checking this script. Without his help, without his guidance, this kind of isekai stuff would not have been possible. So big ups to Damien for knowing quite a bit of stuff about on that end. But yeah, what else am I missing? If you're interested in isekai in a really digestible way, I would also recommend Mudan TV. He actually made a video about isekai recently, well, relatively recently compared to this video. He made a video about isekai recently that I think you might enjoy. It's got a great beat, it's got a fun beat, and it touches upon a lot of things that I didn't touch upon. Like why is it oftentimes set in a fantasy world? Why are some of the conditions? Why isn't SAO considered isekai in Japan? In some instances it is, in some other instances. Those kinds of things. So Mudan TV has a great video on that. There is a little bit of a sort of favoritism element to it because I did help him out with the script on that end. So I did help him out with the script, so there is a favoritism on my end, but I do think, nevertheless, if I had come into this from like a distance perspective of somebody who didn't help out that script, I still would have thought that was a great introduction to some of the basic ideas of isekai and some of the things associated with that. So please check it out. Please give him some love if you can. What else am I missing? Oh, yes, Patreon. As the names were just literally running up to the sides here, thank you to everybody who has supported me on Patreon, everybody who is supporting me on Patreon. All the names are just running up on the side there. I know that it's a really sort of cringy thing to be talking about patrons and Patreon and all that kind of stuff, but it is kind of a vital and necessary thing, especially considering that AdSense usually amounts to pennies for these kinds of videos, so I hugely appreciate everybody who's willing to help me out on that regard. So thank you very much, everybody. I know there's a lot of stuff. If you're interested in backing me on Patreon, that would be hugely appreciated, but you don't have to. There are some stuff that you do get. You get you get Scrolls' music that he makes for these videos. You get the thumbnail drawings. I don't know what you're going to need them for, but you get the thumbnail drawings that I make. You get, editing stuff. Extra editing stuff, editing info. I'm going to be working on uploading like the assets, the cleaned assets and all that kind of stuff that I use, that I make, all that kind of stuff. I might just put them all onto Patreon, all that kind of stuff in the coming days or weeks or however long it'll take me to do it. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I don't have anything else coming to mind, so I'm just going to cut the video right here.